Have you wondered which is the best account to save for your first home? Most Canadians know that they can use the RRSP, TFSA, and the new FHSA account for their down payment. But which one is the GO that you should be prioritizing? As a financial planner who've spent a decade working with clients to save for their first home, I was honored to be invited to the TD Inside Investing podcast as a guest speaker to talk about the FHSA account, the key details and also the strategies that everyone should know about before they start saving into it. So in this video, I've compiled the top 5 tips about the FHSA from the TD podcast, so you can learn if the FHSA is the best account for you, as well as the things to watch out for that are not as obvious. Enjoy!
Welcome to another edition of Inside Investing, the show that helps you level up your financial knowledge and sharpen your investing skills. I'm your host, Rob Moise. The FHSA is now available through TD Direct Investing, and we're excited to help you understand how best to use this account. And here to help us with that is today's guest speaker. Joining us is Ryan Lee, financial planner at Twain Financial. Ryan, great to have you on the program. Thanks for taking the time to demystify this account for us. As someone starting from, ground zero, they're looking to save for a home, what are some of those first steps that they could take to kind of get themselves ready to save and invest as much as possible to, lurch towards that down payment?
The first step to saving towards any goal, like home purchase or vacation, whatever, is you really should first do your budgeting. And that means you should track your last 3 months of expenses. And this will give you a much clearer picture of what your fixed expenses are, what are some of the discretionary expenses that you have. And this way, it really just allows us to see what's the average cash flow that we're going to be seeing. When you know your average cash flow, then you can really allocate your money into different buckets. Everyone has more than one goal, right? Most people want to buy a home, of course, but they also want to maybe buy a car or go on vacation. We want to make sure we set up different buckets because these buckets will basically determine when we need to use the money and what's a risk tolerance with that money. And ultimately, that will determine what kind of account we should be using, saving towards these various goals. So that's why first step, always do your budgeting first. Then this way, you wouldn't be stuck in a position where you have an FHSA or you've been putting money into FHSA, but now you want to buy a car and you're kind of stuck, right? Because all the money is kind of locked up in the FHSA and you can't use it unless you're willing to take a huge tax hit, of course.
Right, like a little budgeting, a little financial planning. It's often not fun, but it can really help out in the big picture for sure. Ryan, let's get into the FHSA. You're a big fan of it. And I just want to know, why do you think it's such a game changer for Canadians hoping to buy their first home?
Yeah, I think FHSA is a great tool for Canadians to really speed up their down payment savings. When you make a contribution into the FHSA, you'll receive a tax deduction, just like you would with the RSP. Now, the FHSA does have a contribution limit, and that's $40,000 in the entire lifetime. You do just get $8,000 per year when you first start the account. Let's say you maximize your $40,000 of contribution room, assuming you're in the marginal tax rate of 30%, that will give you an extra $12,000 in tax savings by just maximizing this account. And if you are a couple together buying a property, that's an extra $80,000 to $100,000 that could be used towards your down payment. So it's a really great way to save up for your future home, and you can also withdraw everything, including your investment gains tax-free.
Yeah, and it's a really powerful tool from that perspective. And certainly you can also combine it with other programs that are out there, like the homebuyers plan through the RRSP. That's another, as of this year, I believe, another $60,000 that each person could take out. So all of a sudden, if you can save the money, you can have access to a lot of it for that down payment. So let's go through some of the details here of the FHSA. Like, can you kind of break down some of the key rules that investors should kind of understand about this account as they're opening it up?
Yeah, so the FHSA is open to anyone who's 18 plus years old, and you do have to be considered a first-time home buyer. Now, I think this is also one of the things that people should know about is the definition of the first-time home buyer is that as long as you did not live in a home that's owned by you in the previous 4 calendar years. What that means is for people who own an investment property that's being rented out, and as long as they haven't lived in that for the past 4 years, as their primary residence, they're still going to be considered as a first-time home buyer. So they would also be eligible to open an FHSA and really use this account to their advantage to buy their primary residence in the future. And inside this FHSA account, you can hold any investments just like you would with the RSP and the TFSA. This includes stocks, bonds, mutual funds, GICs in cash, or some alternative investments as well. So I would say FHSA is really a hybrid between the TFSA and the RRSP, because it's really designed in a way that it can help first-time home buyers to save their home purchase. And because the contributions is going to be tax deductible, first of all, just like the RSP, and you can withdraw it out tax-free as well, just like the TFSA. This is why a lot of times when clients ask me, hey, which account should I save into first when I'm saving for our first home? My answer is, there's a couple of follow-up questions, of course, but most of the time it ends up being FHSA is probably going to be the best account you should be using.
Yeah, and we're going to get into that optimal order of contributions. There are some like little asterisks and parameters and stuff that we need to keep in mind, but that's a little teaser here to one of your tips. It's a really important thing there. Now, one thing, and I mentioned it earlier here, is that we do have the home buyers plan that's available through the RRSP. Now we have the FHSA in the mix. What are some of like the key differences that people need to appreciate about these two accounts, and also kind of using them together?
For those who don't know what the RSP home buyers plan is, it used to be only $35,000. So you get a $35,000 of tax-free withdrawal for your first home purchase. Now, since 2024, the withdrawal limit actually has increased to $60,000. The one thing that we need to be aware of is it does require us to repay into our account over 15 years, starting in the 5th year after we purchase our home. The government is basically saying, we do want you to save towards your retirement still, but we'll give you about 5 years to, get used to the mortgage payments and stuff, and then you should restart your retirement savings. And this is actually where the FHSA completely crushes the RSP, is because with the FHSA, you can withdraw everything out tax-free. There's no limit, and there's also no repayment as well. So there's really no strings attached when it comes to FHSA. The one thing to be aware of, though, is that you can only keep FHSA account open for 15 years. It's something to be aware of, but it's really not too much of a concern for most Canadians, because most people, when they're saving hard towards their home, they can probably buy it within 15 years.
Yeah, one of the neat things about the FHSA that really piqued my interest is that you can basically transfer the funds from the FHSA to your RRSP even if you don't end up buying a home, right? Like it's effectively like a new room that you're getting that you could put towards your retirement if you decide for whatever reason you don't want to buy a home. That's a pretty awesome feature, wouldn't you say?
Exactly. Yeah, I think, worst case, if you don't use it for a home, then you just transfer it into RSP, and you basically treat the FHSA contribution room as a free RSP contribution room. And you can really use that to speed up your retirement savings. So
we've talked about some of the basics here about the FHSA. Let's say I'm an investor. I've saved up money in my FHSA. I'm ready to buy a home now. The moment has come. What would I need to do to actually access that money and use it towards a down payment without kind of getting dinged with any sort of fee or anything?
Yeah, so you would need a written agreement, first of all, to buy or build a qualifying home. You basically need a written agreement by the end of the October of the year after you withdraw. But one thing also is that you also need to fill out a form to apply for that withdrawal.
What happens if you withdraw the money, you have the intention of buying a home, and then for whatever reason you don't? Are you able to put the money back in the account and not face any penalty, or are you going to have to pay tax on it if you don't make that transaction happen?
There is something that you can apply through the government where you'd let them know, hey, I'm not doing it and I just want to put the money back, right? That's something that you could do as well.
Okay, I think that's a relief for a lot of would-be home buyers here. Another interesting thing too, like you don't have to just put FHSA money towards a down payment. You can also do it for other housing-related things. Can you kind of just expand on that a little bit? I thought that was really interesting.
The way how the withdrawal works, once you satisfy the requirements to withdraw tax-free, the government doesn't really care like how you use that money. Once you submit the form, they're okay with it. The money just goes out in cash to your bank account, tax-free. At that point, you can really use that cash for any purpose. Instead of putting it as a down payment, maybe you want to use it to furnish your new home. You can use it at your discretion. You don't really need to put it into your mortgage.
Interesting. Now we've talked pretty highly of the FHSA to this point, but are there any drawbacks in your view that people need to be aware of?
In my opinion, there's not really too many drawbacks to the account, but there are some things I find a little bit annoying. One thing is that you only get $8,000 a year in contribution group rather than the full $40,000. The worst part is when you don't have an account open, you don't accumulate any contribution group. So my advice is always open an FHSA account first even if you don't have the money to save in it yet. As long as you qualify as a first-time home buyer and you're 18 years old, open an account first, because even if you don't save any money, you will at least have that contribution room ready when you have the money to catch up. That being said, there is also a limit to that as well. The maximum carry forward amount is only $8,000. What that means, let's say you miss 2 years in a row, then in the third year, you're still going to be able to only put $16K into the account. You can't catch up more than $8,000 at a time.
One thing I just kind of wanted to pick your brain about here is, do you think that we're talking about minimum down payment here, which would be like 5%? Do you think that generally speaking, people, at least in your experience, tend to put down more than 5%? And what's the benefit of doing that, if so?
Yeah, I think most people try to put down 20% down payment, just because when you have less than 20%, you do need to buy additional mortgage insurance, and that will add to the monthly cost. And of course, with a bigger down payment, your monthly payments is going to be more affordable. I think that should be the number one thing people should be focusing on when they buy a home is how affordable is it? Once I buy a home, is it going to affect my lifestyle? Or am I going to be a house slave?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, we want to buy a home to improve the quality of our life, not be chained to it, basically, right? Now let's get to those top tips about using the FHSA that you have here. And we kind of already touched on it a little bit here, but that first tip being just to open the FHSA as soon as possible, even if you aren't looking to buy a home anytime soon. I think some people might be a little bit confused by that. Can you just walk us through your reasoning again? Why would somebody want to open it as soon as possible?
The main thing is when you open an FHSA account, you will start getting the contribution room, like I mentioned. If you don't open it, for example, like right now it's December. If you don't have an account yet, I would suggest you open one right away, because if you pass the December 31st deadline, then let's say, for example, next year you want to really become serious in saving towards your down payment and you have $16,000 ready to go. If you open an account next year, you can't put in $16K, right? You'll be limited to only $8,000. A lot of accounts out there you can open without putting any contributions as well. Then just have an account open so that you accumulate that contribution group. But of course, if you have some savings aside and you don't really have any use for it besides saving for your down payment, and you don't mind having it locked up for the home purchase, then you should go ahead and actually contribute some money inside. But at the very least, open an account first, and if you are investing with it, then you will benefit from the compound interest.
I mean, compound interest, I believe they call it the eighth wonder of the world. It can be a very powerful thing, particularly over longer periods of time. So yeah, I guess even if you're not totally certain, do I want to own a home or do I not want to, there's not really a ton of downside. Because again, like we were talking about, you can just roll that FHSA contribution and growth into your RRSP anyway, and hey, it's retirement money for you there. One thing I wanted to ask you about was, I could see a lot of parents wanting to get their child to open this. And maybe their child's 18 years old or 19 years old or something like that. They aren't really making a lot of income at this point, but the parent wants to help them save for down payment. Like, does it make sense in that situation to open an FHSA, or do you wait a little bit longer at least?
I think it follows the same logic, where if the child is qualified to open an FHSA account, you should do so as well, even if you don't plan to save any money for them yet. And of course, if you have money for saving for their down payment, then yeah, you can give them some money, put it in their FHSA account, and so they would get a tax deduction. But one thing I would be aware of is make sure you carry that tax deduction forward, because if they're 18 years old, chances are their income is not going to be that high. And most likely it's going to be under $15,000, which is the threshold where you don't pay any tax, so that when they do start working full time, they can use that tax deduction and really get a bigger tax refund.
Okay, so parents, some words of wisdom there for you, and maybe encourage your child to open up that account before the December 31st cutoff. Get that extra contribution while you still can, rather than having to wait the full calendar year for the next round. Okay, Ryan, so your second tip here is to prioritize contributions to an FHSA first, then an RRSP, then a TFSA, if you're someone looking to buy a pre-built home. So can you walk us through the thinking in that optimal order?
Yeah, I think the key thing to pay attention here is if you're looking to buy a pre-built home. And the reason for that is because a lot of times, especially now, things are so expensive, we want to get our foot in the door. And so a lot of people would start considering buying a pre-sale home. These homes that have not been constructed yet. And usually you put a deposit, 10 to 15%, and then you wait a couple more years before it completes building, right? When we want to make the deposit for a pre-sale home, that actually doesn't qualify for the tax-free withdrawal. That's why we want to make the distinction here is are we leaning more towards buying a pre-built home in the future? Or are we leaning towards buying a pre-sale? Because if you're looking for a pre-sale, then this order might not be optimal. But for someone who's looking to buy a pre-built home, then for sure this way is probably going to be the fastest way to get to a maximum down payment amount. Because with FHSA, we do get the tax deduction, like we mentioned, and we can also withdraw that money out tax-free without any repayments. And of course, the tax refund money, we can consider either reinvesting that into the FHSA, or if we already maximized the $8,000 room that year, we can use that to put it into our RRSP instead. RRSP, same thing, it'll give us a tax deduction again, and that will also mean extra tax refunds. So this way, it'll really help us snowball everything into tax savings, investment growth. Finally, once you maximize the FHSA and the RRSP, right, up to $60,000, then you can focus on your TFSA for whatever amount remaining that you want to put towards your home.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Yeah. It would only kind of make sense to do RSP up until that 60,000 home buyers plan limit that you can withdraw for the home, and then anything else is TFSA, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So that's for like a pre-built home, but yeah, like you mentioned, there's that wrinkle that you can't put the FHSA money towards the initial deposit. So that kind of brings us to the pre-construction. So what about if I want to buy a pre-construction home? How does that change that optimal order in your mind of contributions to the various accounts?
With pre-sale homes, you do need to make the deposit. So how we would want to save for that amount of deposit is we would want to use our TFSA for it. In this instance, you would focus on saving your TFSA first. Once you have enough for the deposit, then you can start focusing back to the order of FHSA first, then RSP, and whatever remaining, go back to the TFSA.
Yeah, that's kind of like a curious little reason. Like, why do you have any sense as to why they don't allow the deposit to qualify for FHSA?
I think the main reason is a lot of times people buy a pre-sale throughout those couple of years, maybe their life situation changes, and so they end up not actually completing the property. They end up maybe assigning it or selling the pre-sale home before it actually completes. And one thing to be careful of is to qualify for the tax-free withdrawal, not only do you need a written agreement, but you also need to be living in that home within 1 year of purchase as your primary residence.
Yeah, that makes sense. They want to make sure that it's actually for first-time home buyers, not people who are basically just trying to profit off of real estate through like a rental property or something like that, or what have you. But in any case, so let's say an investor has built up money in their TFSA. This is something that I've heard as a potential tactic. I want to see if you think it makes sense. They have money built up in their TFSA, and they think I could withdraw money from my TFSA, put it into my FHSA, get the tax deduction, and Bob's your uncle. Is that a sensible strategy to take in your mind?
I think, again, if we refer back to our first question, right, is are you leaning more towards buying a pre-built home? And if the answer is yes, I do think it's a great idea, assuming that they're willing to lock that money in for their eventual home purchase. Because one thing that, why a lot of people like the TFSA a lot is because of the flexibility it gives. Like, you can withdraw the money tax-free. You can basically do it anytime for any purpose, aside from obviously the tax-free growth. Once you withdraw the money, you do get back the contribution room in the following year with your TFSA as well.
As we're on the topic of accounts here, one of the things that we just talked about was that you think it makes sense to prioritize the RRSP at least up until the home buyers plan limit of 60,000 over the TFSA. Again, if you're looking to buy a pre-built home. But that kind of contradicts a little bit of what I would call like traditional wisdom that often gets like floated out there, that this idea that it doesn't really make sense to contribute to an RRSP over a TFSA if you're someone who earns something in the vicinity of like $55,000 or less, something like that, because the tax benefit is going to be relatively modest versus like maybe down the line you make more money and your tax deduction would be larger. So why do you think that you should still kind of prioritize the RRSP over the TFSA if you're somebody earning roughly $50,000 a year?
Yeah, first of all, that's a common misconception, because there's always a saying that when you're earning less than $50,000, you're in too low of a tax bracket to benefit from using RSPs, right? And people say you should probably hold off on using the RSPs until you reach a higher income. Now, that's simply not true unless you know for sure you're going to get a much higher income and reach a higher tax bracket in the next 1 to 2 years. When you're making less than 50K, yes, you're in a lower tax bracket, but your marginal tax rate is still going to be like 20% based on BC tax rates. So this means that any contributions you make to your RSP, it will still give you 20% back in tax savings. For example, if you save $5,000 a year, assuming we reinvest the tax saving back into the RSP with a 6% growth, you would basically get $5,300 after year one, and then it'll jump to $13,000 in year two, and eventually by year six, you would have $51,000 in your RSP account. Now, let's compare that to if you save the same amount of money. You save $5,000 in your TFSA, you still have 6% growth, but now you would only have $37,000 by year six, right? So that's $14,000 extra, or 38% more when you're using RSP versus TFSA. Again, if you expect your income to be around the same, right, or you're just seeing slight increases in your income, then chances are you're more likely to benefit more by claiming the tax deduction now and really taking advantage of the compound interest and letting your money grow for you over time.
I have to admit, I love this chart that you put together in a video of yours that I pulled this from. Okay, Ryan, let's move on to your third tip, and that's to immediately claim the tax deduction that you get from FHSA contributions in most cases. How do you think that this could be beneficial versus waiting until you earn more income down the line? You can theoretically save more in tax. Why not push that tax deduction forward?
Yeah, so in my opinion, claiming the tax deduction immediately generally makes more sense for people because you want to get the tax savings earlier on so you can really reinvest that money. If we can pull up the tax chart on the screen there, so we can see that, for example, someone who's making $60,000 of income, and you're pretty confident that your income will increase to maybe $90,000 in the next couple of years. That's a pretty hefty jump, first of all. But when we look at the tax brackets, we see that at $60,000 of income, you're in the 29.65% tax bracket. But when you hit $90,000 of income, you're actually still in the exact same tax bracket. So this means that when you delay your tax deduction, it's actually going to make no difference in terms of your tax savings. But you basically just delay that by 3 years, right? Or however long it takes you to hit that higher income. So that's lost opportunity right there that you could have received the tax refunds earlier and even reinvesting it back into your FHSA or your RSP to really snowball that tax savings for yourself.
Yeah, it really comes down, again, back to that power of compound interest. Okay, let's move on to your fourth tip. This is an interesting one and perhaps a little bit controversial. We'll get to the reason why. But your fourth tip here is to avoid holding highly speculative investments. I'm thinking things like cryptocurrencies or like penny stocks or anything like that in an FHSA. The reason why I say it might be controversial to some is because they might say, well, listen, like with the way that house prices are increasing year on year, I'm effectively forced to take more risk in hopes of more return, just to have a chance to keep pace with these rising home prices and build up that down payment so that I can actually one day buy a home. But you still feel that like speculative investments, not something that makes sense in an FHSA, generally speaking. So make the case for us. Why is that?
Yeah, I think most speculative investments are not, it doesn't make sense in an FHSA because they're just so risky and volatile, and there's a real chance that you'd lose that money. If you lose that money, like, of course, that's bad, but you also used up your contribution room, and you never get that contribution room back. So all the tax savings that should have helped you, but if you put into something that it's going to lose you money, then you're really back to square one, or maybe even worse, because you've worked so hard and that will probably put even additional stress on yourself. And so what I would say is, for most people who are looking to save up their home, don't be discouraged about the increasing home prices. Just focus on what you can do that's within your control. Instead of trying to gamble your money with risky investments, really just focus on how do I make sure I save up in the most tax efficient way as possible, and how do I invest in a way that I can have consistent growth, and even if the market has a downturn, I can recover from that given a reasonable amount of time. And it's really, I think here, it's a perfect example of the story of the tortoise and the hare. It's slow and steady wins the race in most cases.
Yeah, one of my favorite little fables growing up as a kid, for sure. Yeah, I think, crypto and things like that, really speculative investments, like we hear a lot about it, and there may be a time and a place for some people who want to do that. But to your point, if you lose that precious contribution room in something that goes bust, that is a really big hit to take. Let's kind of continue that similar vein of thought here with your fifth tip, and that is to kind of shift the asset allocation to a more conservative bent with things like, it could be GICs, could be cash equivalent type kind of products, for example, as you move closer to buying a home. Why do you feel that makes sense? Because I mean, the rate of home price appreciation is probably going to stay roughly the same, in most years. So it's like you're slowing down your earning potential as you get closer to the home. Why would that make sense in your mind?
One of the biggest factors when we determine how we should allocate our assets is the time horizon. Most people, they don't really make adjustments because they really just maybe fill a questionnaire at the beginning and they just follow that until the end, until they eventually pull the money out for their first home. Of course, that might work in a lot of cases, but if you're unlucky and the market drops a couple months before you buy a home, then now you're in real trouble because now you might have lost all the gains, or maybe now you're in the negative. It's better to plan ahead to know that, okay, if I'm going to buy a home, let's say like next year, then it's a good time to start moving money away from equities and more into fixed income. This way, you can still have some equity exposure, you can still have some growth there, but if there's a downturn, at least okay, most of my money is secure in the fixed income side, because you want to make that happen next year, right? You don't want to be in a situation where when I'm buying a home, I need to consider selling my investments at a loss just to make it happen.
Gotcha. Okay. Thanks for kind of clarifying that. We are sort of wrapping up the interview portion of our conversation here. We've heard a lot of interesting perspectives on the show, Ryan. And so I wanted to bounce some of the ideas that we've heard in the past to see if you kind of disagree or agree or what have you. So how does that sound? Are you ready for it?
Yeah, let's go.
All right. Our first one, this first idea, it comes from our DIY investor, Joy Yang, who's joined us before, and she kind of shared her experience saving for a down payment through the stock market crash of 2020. Let's hear what she experienced there.
I was like super freaked out. But again, went online, see what other people were saying, and they're saying, stocks are on sale, ETFs are on sale, you should buy. But I was super risk averse, and I have no idea how long it takes for a stock market crash to bounce back. I had no idea about anything. So I did kind of, put a little bit of money into some dividend stocks, some ETFs, but I kind of didn't want to dabble too much into what looked risky to me. And I'm very sad for not, buying more when the stock market crashed.
Okay, so Joy, feeling a little bit of lack of buyer's remorse, I suppose, here. She wished she had sort of bought the dip, so to speak, on that market crash as she was saving for a home. What do you think about that idea, Ryan? Is it better to kind of just stick to your plan and play it safe, perhaps with a more conservative allocation, or do you double down on what seems to be an opportunity in equities after a big stock market crash? What do you think?
Yeah, I think, everyone at some point would have had that same feeling. Hey, I saw the market crash. I had that feeling that I should be buying in, but I didn't buy enough. I think when it comes to buying the dip, it's often a good idea if you don't need to use the money for at least 2 to 3 years. This is mainly because when we look at historical data, the market takes on average 2 years to recover from a crash. And the thing is, because we don't know when the timing is, for example, when you buy into the dip, is it actually the bottom of the dip? Or is it going to go even further down and it'll maybe take some time to hit the bottom? The timeline is really for you to make sure that you have enough time on your side so you can wait for the market to recover. Otherwise, if you need to use the money before the market has recovered, then you need to sell your investment at a loss. Another thing I would say you want to make sure is you don't go beyond your risk tolerance. Buying a dip is good, but make sure you don't go beyond your risk tolerance just because you want to take advantage of it. And of course, I do want to remind all investors as well that we shouldn't try to time the market or try to wait for a dip before investing. If you have money being put aside for a specific goal, it should really be invested right away according to your risk tolerance and your time horizon of when you want to use that money. Because the person who continues to stay invested will always beat the person who tries to time the market.
Okay, so what I'm hearing here is a lot of level-headed thinking during a time that could be very emotional for a lot of investors here. So thank you for your perspective on that. Really appreciate it. We have one more idea here. This one comes from Jonathan Needham from TD Asset Management. He is saying that diversification is absolutely crucial to investors who want to invest in equities as they save for a home, as we were just discussing. So let's hear what he has to say.
But if you are going to take, a heavier equity bet, at least make sure you're taking advantage of that diversification free lunch, not even just from an asset class perspective, but even within your equity bucket. Try not to, I'll say make a concentrated bet on a small number of securities. Make sure you're diversifying that as well, both from a geography perspective, a sector perspective. That's extremely important.
So Ryan, what's your take here, Ryan? How much diversification is the right amount of diversification when you're saving for a home, in your opinion?
I would agree with what John said, that we really want to diversify our investments geographically and also through the sectors as well. What I've been seeing a lot in recent 2 years is everyone is focusing on tech. Some clients, they work in tech companies, they might hold their company stock and it's basically like 80% of their portfolio in just one stock. In a diversification perspective, that's actually really risky. If that one company drops, and the thing is with stocks, it's not just about the company performance. Sometimes the performance of the company can be very good, but if the investor's perception of it is bad, or like they see a bad outlook of it, then the stock price would drop as well. A lot of those things are actually out of our control. So one thing we can safeguard our investments is to make sure that we diversify. So we have some in US, some in Canada, right? Some in Europe, maybe some in emerging markets. And of course, through the sectors as well. We don't want everything in tech. We want it to be diversified through maybe some in banks that will give us dividends and also other sectors.
Right. Tech is the sort of the flavor of the day and really maybe of the decade more accurately, but it's not necessarily going to be moving forward. We don't know that, right? So diversification, as John said, the only free lunch in investing, as they say. Okay, Ryan, thanks so much for playing along with us here. We're at the end of our interview portion, but we're not done yet. We're going to take a few questions from our audience, open the floor to them. Are you ready to hear what they want to know more about?
Yeah, for sure.
All right, this one is from Cass, and Cass wants to know, what do you think about the idea of borrowing to invest to help afford a down payment? So it sounds like Cass is willing to take some risk here. What do you think about that idea, Ryan?
I think borrowing to invest is definitely an idea that you could consider, especially for higher income earners. But it obviously is a lot more risky, right? Because you're magnifying your gains, but you're also magnifying your losses. You will need to look at what the interest rates are. Right now, the interest rates aren't looking too great. It's very high right now compared to a couple of years back. So it does make it less attractive. Another thing why I said it's more for higher income earners is because these are the people who are more likely to have maximized their TFSA, FHSA, and also their RRSP. It's when you need to start using your non-registered accounts to invest. That's when you can see more of the benefits of borrowing to invest, because when we borrow money to invest, the interest expense is tax deductible as well. A lot of people just consider this as a way of tax planning, where I can write off more of my income and get additional tax savings there.
Okay, so definitely a lot of potential risks there to consider, Cass. So you probably want to seek out some extra perspective there. But Ryan, thank you for sharing yours. We have another question here. This one is coming from Ted. Ted wants to know, do you think it would make sense to transfer money from my RRSP into my FHSA? What are the benefits and drawbacks potentially of doing that? We talked earlier about moving money from TFSA into FHSA. What about the other way around, sort of, where we go from RRSP into FHSA? Could that make sense?
I would say for most people, there's not going to be much benefits of doing that, just because when you transfer your money from RRSP to FHSA, it is going to be tax-free, but you don't get another tax deduction from that transfer. And it does use up your FHSA room as well. I would say the only situation where you might benefit is if you have the money that you want to use for a home, and you want to buy the home now, but you don't have enough money to contribute into your FHSA. So maybe you already saved up a good amount of money in your RSP, and now you're looking to buy a house and you don't have more money to put into your FHSA. Then that would be a case where it makes sense to transfer the money to your FHSA just so you can have that no strings attached tax-free withdrawal. But besides that, there's really no extra benefit from transferring into FHSA.
I think that's all the time we have for the Q&A. So thank you so much for sharing your perspective there, Ryan. Really appreciate it. Just before we go, do you have any maybe final thoughts or anything like that you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, so I think lastly, I just want to remind everyone to open an FHSA account before the year end. That way you can really speed up your contribution room accumulation. So at least the room is ready when you have money to put into it.
Awesome stuff. I will say some fantastic videos on your YouTube channel. I certainly learned a lot. I imagine others will as well.
Saving for your first home is definitely not an easy task. And this leads me to something that you need to realize. And that is you should really pay attention to how much taxes you're paying, because that might just be the biggest thing that is slowing you down. Click here to learn what you can do to legally pay less tax.